Welcome to an all-new episode of Get Lit with Lianna, the podcast. Join me as I sit down with a new guest author in each episode to discuss their books, careers, and everything in between. Today I'm sitting down with author Emma Gray to chat about her new book, Pictures of You. This book took me completely by surprise. It is an incredible love story that has so many twists and turns and elements of mystery and almost psychological thriller vibes. It took me on a trip, one that I was not expecting. I literally could not put this book down. I devoured it in one sitting. I literally have been screaming about this book to everyone I know and love that they will like it as well. It definitely has some heavier, more serious subject matter. However, it's such an important story, especially for women of all ages across the world. And I really, really loved getting to chat about this book in depth with the writer. Emma's writing background is so incredible. She's done so many different cool things. And this book has quickly become one of my favorites of the year. So make sure to check out this podcast episode and read the book and let me know what you think. Without further ado, my interview with Emma Gray starts right now. Welcome, Emma, to the podcast. I'm very excited to have you here. If anyone listening has been following me recently on Instagram, you know that I literally devoured your latest book, Pictures of You, in one sitting. I could not put it down. My husband was like, okay, it's enough. We have to eat dinner. Like, put the book down. And I was like, we'll eat when we're dead. Like, I cannot stop reading this book right now. It was such a surprise and such a interesting story and really unlike anything I've read before. So I'm very, very excited to have you here today to get to chat. But first, before we talk about this book, I would love to know a little bit more about you and your background. I did a little bit of research and there was something I learned about you that I think is super interesting, but I want to hear a little bit more from you. Firstly, how your whole writing career started, how we kind of got to the moment we're in right now.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's so lovely. And I can't tell you how encouraging it is for an author when you have a reader who is giving you live feedback almost as you're reading a book, because we spend so much time on our own, in our pajamas, writing these books, worrying about whether they'll ever be published, and if they are published, whether anyone will read them. And then if someone reads them, will they like it? All of these, self-doubts that authors have. So it's just so lovely when somebody engages with you as they're going. It's just really precious. So thank you for that, and also for this.
Of course.
So I'm now 51, and I can pinpoint the moment that I realised I was a writer, and it was in the summer holidays, which in Australia is over the Christmas period. We have our long summer holidays, and I was staying at my grandmother's house, and she and my aunties and my mum introduced my sister and I to Anne of Green Gables. So you hear this, I think Anne is responsible for a lot of writers. It wasn't just falling in love with Gilbert. It was falling in love with Anne and her dream to be a writer. And that just caught my imagination as a little 14-year-old. And this was, of course, pre-laptops. And I walked to the local news agency the very next day and bought a notebook and pen and started writing what I was sort of imagining would be Australia's answer to Anne of Green Gables.
Okay, I love that.
It was terrible. It was absolutely terrible. But but what I realized was that I couldn't stop just scrawling this book on these pages. And my sister looked at me and said, "Why are you wasting your holidays doing homework?" That's how she kind of perceived my sitting there writing. And I thought, it doesn't feel like homework. It feels nothing like school. It feels just so liberating and so much fun. And everywhere I went that holiday, that story was just in my mind. I was carrying it around in my head, and it's been like that ever since, for decades. So I wrote a book when my daughters, who are now in their 20s, were little, called Wits End Before Breakfast, Confessions of a Working Mum. And it was just sort of a satirical memoir of the chaos of being a parent. And then I didn't really start writing more fiction. I sort of dabbled in fiction, but the kids were young and there was a lot going on. I was working. And it wasn't until my daughter was 14 and hated reading but loved Harry Styles that I thought, what can I do to turn this situation around? And started writing a novel about a boy band for teenagers. And so that ended up being published by HarperCollins. And then I co-wrote a musical along with my own high school friend, who's a composer here in Australia and just brilliant. And so we co-wrote a musical based on that book, which was just so much fun, so much fun. And we put it on in my daughter's school, which was, just a lovely thing. And then it wasn't till 2016 I had the tragic loss of my husband. He died suddenly from a heart attack, and I just knew that after all these decades of writing, I was going to have to use writing to get through that loss. So I did, and what eventually transpired was my first adult fiction, The Last Love Note, and now a couple of years later, Pictures of You.
Wild. You've had such an insane like trajectory. And the one thing that I wanted to talk to you about, which you mentioned, was your musical theater background in terms of like writing this
Yeah,
musical. I'm obsessed with musical theater, like really so in love. It's my favorite thing ever. And the fact that the book that the play that you wrote was based on was like like a boy band fiction, because I also am obsessed
yeah.
with Harry Styles, as is I feel like everyone
Oh,
my
who isn't
age.
really?
Who isn't? And even older and younger, everyone's
Yeah.
obsessed with them.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
I just can't even imagine like what that was like to try to write a musical. And I've never had anyone on my show who's kind of parlayed into like stage writing in that capacity. So I'm so
Yeah.
curious, like what that
Oh,
experience was like for you, and like if there's any plans to do anything more with the production. Like I would love to
yes. Oh,
all about
yes. We'd absolutely. Yes, definitely. And it was all kind of um, getting off the ground just before COVID hit. So unfortunately, that then put the spanner in the works for all musical theatre and anything live for quite some time. But we're getting back into that
that.
now, and it was amazing. My friend Sally Whitwell, the composer, got in touch with me after reading the novel, and she said, and she was actually classically trained pianist and she'd won a couple of Australia's biggest music industry awards
Mhm.
for her classical work, and she said, "Look, I've never been interested in boy bands." And I've never really been interested in boys either, but I read this book and absolutely devoured it. And I would love to write a musical with you. And it was just so special because we'd been in high school together ourselves. And so it was this incredible process as an author of letting go of your story and letting somebody else in as the co-creator for the next life that you're giving
Mhm.
it. And she just so it all happened. I was writing it around the time that Jeff died, and he knew about this project and was really so supportive of it. And then when we staged it the following year, it really was the thing that saved me. Just being surrounded by teenage theatre kids and just all that exuberance, and the disco ball and the glitter cannons and all that excitement. It really was this bright spark in the midst of the worst possible year that I could have had. And then I remember that feeling too I'd let it go, to Sally to create the music, and then we had to let it go then to the director of the show, who then hands it to the actors, and you find yourself moving several steps backwards. But at no point did I think, I mean, it just felt like this liberating thing. I never worried about, the story no longer being just mine. I think as an author, you've lost that the second the book is published because it's now everybody's. And so just brilliant. I would love to do a lot more with it. And we were selected for a couple of industry opportunities in Australia, which gave us exposure to some of our top musical theatre directors and producers and performers. And we got such valuable feedback, and they said that they could see it going all the way to a young Broadway chorus. They said it was really, because she's so innovative with her composing and has come at it from a different angle. So here's hoping. But one of the beautiful things that she did was she said in high schools in particular, a lot of the time when the musical is on, it's just the musical theatre kids that really get an opportunity to shine. So she made sure that she wrote music for all the different kinds of musicians in a school and different voices. So there's
Wow.
a classical voice for one of the characters, a pop voice, musical theatre voices, and then even like the electronic dance music, bedroom producers could get involved and put their stamp on, some of the boy band hits that she's also written for this show. So it was one of my highlights as a creative person.
That's amazing. I always say, like, what a dream it must be to see, like, as an author, to see like your story get like new wings and like be transferred to different mediums. But I feel like we're seeing now a real like bump in like books becoming musicals. I know there's always been like books
Yeah.
becoming plays, but like The Notebook, for example, was adapted for the stage as a musical. Like The Outsiders this year was adapted for a stage as a musical. It's so fun to see that
Yeah,
now.
it
Um,
is.
so when I learned this about you, I was like, I need to ask all these questions and like I need to hear how this came to be because it's amazing. And as someone who like loves obviously books and also loves musical theater, I love to see like
Mm.
synergies here and how they come to be. But obviously you're here to talk about pictures of you, so I would be remiss to not just jump right into it. But for those who have not yet picked up the book, can you give like a little synopsis as to what the story is about?
So it's a story about Evie, who is 29, and she wakes up after the accident that has killed her husband, and she has no recollection of him or of anything during the period of their whole marriage or relationship. And she met him quite young. She met him in high school when she was 16. And so the entire novel is then written with a main character that doesn't know what's happening, which is, as a pantser novelist, was really challenging because I also didn't know what was happening. So that the two of us were just
Oh my goodness.
stumbling our way through. So and what she discovers is that when you go to a funeral and there's a slideshow of the montage of images from the person's life, and she's obviously, as his wife, starring in this montage and thinking, I don't remember this. I don't even like it. And she looks around her and doesn't really like anything about her 29-year-old life. And also notices that the key people in her life, her parents and her best friend, are absent. And so the entire novel then is piecing together what happened. How did her life go so far off track? Because she used to be such an ambitious and studious and big dreaming teenager, and she's ended up in a life a lot smaller than the one she imagined.
Mhm.
And it deals with some pretty heavy topics. My daughter, who's 26, she also loves Harry Styles, but it was her sister that I wrote the other one for. But Hannah is doing a doctorate in criminology, and her area of study is gendered violence against women. So there is a heavy theme in this book that I don't think is a spoiler.
Wow.
Of coercive control. And I think it's just such a rampant, it's a pandemic really of violence in a lot of countries. And
Mm.
um, so it was just such a beautiful experience as a mum to be able to work closely with my daughter in taking the kind of work that she does academically and then translating that into a fictional story that I hope is accessible to a lot of people.
Mhm. I, for one, when I picked up the book, all I knew was the synopsis. I kind of went in a little bit blind. And immediately when I started reading it, once Evie comes to, my first thought was, oh my God, this is very like reminiscent of 30 going on 13 going on 30, which is so funny because
Yes.
then you literally make that like reference in the book, which has
Yeah.
nothing. But what I loved is that it's such a more elevated story. There's none of this like magical element to it. It's very much a true, could be true scenario. And just like you just mentioned, the topics you touch in this story are not light by any means. They're very real, a lot of very like heavy and real life scenarios women find themselves in. So I'm very curious how this whole concept came to you, aside from the fact that you obviously had an interest in some of these
Mm,
topics when working with your daughter, but how did this entire concept come to you, especially being a pantser and not really
mm.
outlooking, as you just mentioned? I'm very curious about like the entire process in terms of like conception and then like actually putting pen to paper.
Yes. Well, I so wish I was a plotter because I feel like my life would be so much easier. Um, I've never once plotted a novel, and And I always get into these situations where I've got the second document sitting beside the main one with all the deleted words. And in this case, it was 40,000 words in that document. I've taken out 40,000 words where I'd started writing and had gone in a certain direction and it just wasn't working. And I sort of trapped myself into a corner, and I thought, it's like having a haircut to make your hair grow. I had to cut a whole lot out just to redirect it back on track. And so it's hair raising to write this way. But I just and I wish I could say there was I wish I knew how it works, but I just sit down with a document and a sort of almost a one sentence high level idea of what's going to happen or what it's about. And then I just write chapter one and I just start writing and see what happens. And quite often I'm just as surprised as the reader might be when certain things are revealed, and I just hadn't seen that coming. I
Wow.
know when I wrote my previous novel, The Last Love Note, which I wrote after Jeff died, and so I knew, for example, that book was going to be about a midlife widow falling in love again. So that was the high concept. I just
Mhm.
started writing it and unexpectedly met her neighbor across the road, and then next thing her boss has come in. Like it's I'm thinking, who are you? Who are you? And I didn't expect to see them, and
Yeah.
they then become crucial to the story. And I did things like, in that book I said that there was a secret between her new love interest and her husband who had died.
Mhm.
And so I'd plant that somewhere near the beginning, but I had no idea what that secret was until almost the moment it was revealed to her. So
Wow.
it's a really fun way to write, but a scary way to write as well, because you don't know the book is going to work until you've written it. So even when it comes down to pitching a book to a publisher, and they say, can we have the one page outline of the book? And I'm thinking, well, I really need to write it to get that. Like,
Right.
I've got to write the whole thing to find out what that is.
Right.
And so often I will send a one page outline, but they know that it's probably not going to end up being that book. It'll
Yeah.
change so much.
So how does that work though when you're writing the book and let's say something comes to you 75% of the way through, are you then like going back to the beginning
Yes.
and like
Yeah.
re-adding things in and
Yeah.
okay, wow. So it's a
Yeah.
lot
You've
of like
got to.
back
So
and
there was,
forth.
yeah, definitely. I mean, I took 15 drafts with pictures of you,
Wow.
and, um, and it is that it's sort of like you have this realization, three-quarters of the way into writing it. So then you have to retrofit the story to make sure that it makes sense and go back and put little breadcrumbs through, or, just ensure you haven't made it illogical earlier on.
Mhm.
And so it is a lot of, and I've got a friend, Benjamin Stevenson, who writes, I say friend, I've met him once at a festival. Anyway, he's an Australian author, and he writes detective fiction, and he's a very, very detailed plotter. So he writes a 10,000 word document outlining everything that's going to happen in his book before he begins. And then it's a process of just sitting down each day and writing that up.
Mhm.
So I just find it fascinating how different people pull their stories together.
Mhm. Do you find it's harder or easier to write this way when you're doing dual POV?
Well, I do remember going to a writing workshop once, and they said, don't do dual points of view and don't do dual timelines. So I think
Oh,
I
so you
did
just
both.
said I'm going to do both.
Yeah, but again, I actually love writing dual points of view. I love to get into the head of the other character as well, and um, I just think it adds a whole lot of, the reader knows more about the situation than the protagonist, and um, I don't know. It just all sort of unfolded. But I also, with The Last Love Note, the structure was something that I changed at the very last minute. And I was actually feverish and delirious with COVID at the time.
Oh
And
man.
it was sort of due on a Tuesday, and on the Sunday I was very sick. And I just sort of got the idea, I think I might completely restructure this, and just picked up large parts of the book and cut and pasted and put them in a different place. And I posted that on Facebook that I was doing it, and my agent saw that, and she was just panicked. And and then I thought, it's fine. The next day I'll just get up and read through the whole thing before I send it to the publisher and make sure it all makes sense. But then I woke up so sick I couldn't do that, so I just sent it off, and and they loved it. So it a lot of it, I think, is can't be explained. It's just some
Yeah.
sort of creative well that you draw it from, and hopefully it works out.
Yeah. So when you started Pictures of You, like knowing how not like you didn't know which direction this was going in, like how much of the story did you really know? Like what about this were you pretty
I
certain
knew that
about? And like, yeah.
I wanted it to be a book about, I wanted her to have memory loss. I'm really interested in memory. It was a topic in my previous book as well. And while I was writing this book, my mum passed away and she had dementia. And dementia was a storyline in the previous book. So I am fascinated by memory. And I'm also, I think because I am a person who in midlife found myself stranded in a life I didn't recognize,
Mm,
looking around going, well, what am I meant to do now? I did want to capture that feeling as well. So I knew that I wanted it to be about a woman struggling with both of those things. Um, and then I don't read suspense fiction. I don't know how. Well, I think it came about because of my daughter, just talking with her. But that
right.
that whole suspense and sort of almost psychological thriller kind of angle came in. I did stand in a bookshop with Hannah at one stage, and we did say, "What has happened to Evie? What was it? Why is she so traumatized that she has forgotten all of this?" And we came up with the coercive control, that it was coercive control. And I think once I had figured that out with Hannah, then it became easier to write because you could just gradually plant the seeds of such an insidious and manipulative relationship, and I knew that I could then revisit her at various points in that 13 years that she's forgotten, and we'd see just how bad things had gone since the last time we caught up with her. And so structurally it then became quite helpful that this was what had happened. But I also was just so keen to write something that was going to be about a topic that means so much to so many women. I mean, I've had conversations with friends and family and colleagues over every decade of my life about controlling first boyfriends back in the 80s before we even had language for love bombing and gaslighting and coercive control, and then in my 20s and 30s in an office job, before we had mobile phones, you'd pick up the phone on your colleague's desk and it would be her husband ringing for the third or fourth time in a row, wondering where she was and who she was with. And
Mhm.
even now in my 50s, I have friends who have either been through a divorce or through, they're widowed and they're back on the dating circuit and they're falling into dangerous relationships like this. It is just so out of control. And so I knew that I really want to write books that have an important, deeper theme and message as well, and make it easier for people to talk about these kinds of things.
And that's exactly what this book did. And it was, as I said at the beginning here, like it was such a surprise. I did not know that that's where the story was going. And I was so intrigued from start to finish, and I could not put it down. And it was so beautifully written. Like it almost felt like the whole book, when I was messaging a friend who has now started reading the book, but I was trying to convince her to read it. What I was saying was the entire book almost feels like a conversation, which is so interesting. It's just like so smooth the way it continues, even though it jumps timelines and it jumps points of view. It just was very like digestible and believable and readable in a way that like was surprising to me for such hard subject
Yeah,
matter. And I,
it's surprising to me too.
yeah, it was,
Knowing how hard it was to write, like it's so good to hear you say that because it was just so challenging to write.
and it doesn't come off as
Yeah.
though it was like a challenging book for you to put pen to paper. Like it just made sense in every way. But another part of the story that I really loved and I found so fascinating, and I'm so curious to know like your interest or your background, if that's something to do with your daughter also, is the whole like linguistics and the way language really came to be a huge part of uncovering the secret. Like,
Yeah.
what knowledge did you have about this prior to
Yeah.
reading the book? Like, how did that piece come to play? Because it's
Well,
so
yeah, I
interesting.
know. It is. It's fascinating. So there's this whole field of forensic linguistics where crimes can be solved by looking at how people speak, how they write, how they construct sentences, little quirks in their language patterns, which are almost like a fingerprint. but linguistically. And so that actually came from my sister, who did linguistics at uni, and she ended up with the university medal in linguistics, which was, brilliant. And her whole life has been fascinated by forensic linguistics and true crime. And she and Hannah, my daughter, are constantly talking about true crime cases. And so I thought it would be just a fascinating angle to put into this story, to have Evie studying to be a forensic linguist and to use a forensic. We can't sort of talk about what that was because it was that would be a spoiler, but
Yeah.
to use an element of forensic linguistics to figure out exactly what has happened here. And it's enthralling when you look into it. It's just
Yeah.
staggering.
Yes.
It's really, really interesting field of study and field of criminology as
Yeah.
well.
No, it was the best like little addition
Yeah.
to this book. There was so much here to unpack. And like as I was reading it also, I was just envisioning it like playing out almost like a movie. So I'm very
Yes.
curious, have you ever like considered adapting any of your novels in, I know you
Yes.
adapted for the stage, but have you thought about like for the screen in any capacity, for
Yeah.
this story in any
Yeah.
capacity? Like, yeah.
It would be a dream, absolute dream, if that happened for any of them. And I know my agents are having a couple of chats at the moment with some producers. But I mean, as they've said to me numerous times, don't get excited. The whole process of any of that takes years and can fall over at any point. But
Yeah.
I think this one in particular, it would be really well suited either to a movie or to a TV series as
Mhm.
well, just because there's so much to unpack and it's so relevant and
Mhm.
disturbing, but also has this beautiful romantic storyline as well.
100%.
And I was so keen because obviously Anne of Green Gables, that's where I've come from, and I'm never going to be able to leave that, I don't think. But I did want to have two relationships in this book, one being the toxic one, and then one being a really healthy one and a beautiful one. So, and I also was really keen to have those two love interests, these two men, both having had a traumatic past, because I think, it's a lot of people who are become abusive will look to their childhood or their past and say, well, this is why. And there is a point at which you become responsible for your own behavior. And I wanted to have the other character also have had a traumatic past and have not
Mhm.
gone down that path. And so I think that's another important thing. And I probably wrote this book as a mother, not only of my two young adult daughters, but of my 14-year-old son. And to be giving him, particularly when he doesn't have his dad around anymore,
Mhm.
to have these strong male characters that I like to write as an example to him, because he sits there listening to the whole process while I'm figuring it all out, and he knows a lot about the story as it's being written. So
Yeah.
even if he's not the target audience for the book, I think he must absorb some of the messages as we go along.
No, it's amazing. Amazing, amazing. Well, thank you so, so, so much for taking the time. I can't say enough incredible things about this book. It's seriously one of my favorites of the year. And it was, as I said before, so surprising. And I know everyone will love it. I'm like making all of my friends and my sister-in-law, my sister, I'm making my mom, making everyone read it because I just think it's such an important story. And for anyone who like loves romance books and love stories, there's still such an incredible love story there, but it's so much more, as you said. So I'm very, very excited for everyone else to read it. And I so thank you for taking the time to chat with me today.
Oh, I thank you too. It's been so lovely to talk to you.